Hi, biologists. Nice to see you again. Before we get into some other topics in science today, I wanted to show you these two pictures because they both have P-L-A-N-T. Let's sound it out. Plant. Plant. This also says plant. So when you say plant, there's two different things it could mean. It could mean a living thing that grows in soil. We see it's got like its roots, stem, leaves. So this is a plant. It's a living thing that grows in soil. But you could also plant a garden. So sometimes if you're saying, I am going to plant, it doesn't mean you're going to turn into one of these. It means you want to put a seed, flower, or plant in the ground to grow. So there's two different things that the word plant can mean. I just wanted to point that out because otherwise it can be very confusing when you hear those words. So I want us to think today more about the relationship between plants and animals and humans because we are all connected. What I do has an impact on plants and animals. What an animal does has an impact on plants and maybe me. And same thing with plants. What plants do has an impact on myself, on humans, and animals. So here are some pictures of plants and animals living together. They're all in the same habitat. And I want you to think about what's their relationship. How do you think that these animals are all connected? I don't mean like they're cousins or aunts or uncles. I mean the impact that they have on each other when they live all together like this. What do you think? How are they related? Here's a little bit more about what I mean. The butterfly will help to pollinate all of these plants so that the plants can grow. And when the plants grow, the birds have a place to live. And the birds can feed a hungry fox. So if the butterflies didn't do their job, the bird wouldn't have anywhere to live, and then what would the fox eat? They're all connected. Let's look what's living down here. There's other little animals making dens down here in the tree's roots. So the tree provides a habitat for those animals. Without the tree, they would have nowhere to live, and the fox could possibly also eat them. And then, of course, we know that we are related to the plants and animals because the plants give us clean air to breathe. Sometimes plants will give us food. And sometimes animals give us food. We don't eat things like mice and fox and birds, but we do eat other animals that eat plants. And here's another picture, a different habitat. Here's some bugs living in the soil, a bird. We see some bigger animals back here. So how are all of these creatures and plants related? Sort of the same thing, right? Where the birds will eat these slugs. The slugs and bugs are living off of the soil and the plants. The birds might eat some of those bugs. This looks like it's like a gopher or a mole. They live underground by the roots. And then these bigger animals might eat some of the smaller animals. This looks like a deer, and in some places people do eat deer. So again, we're related to them because we eat some of these plants and animals and they give us clean air to breathe. Animals have a reason why they live the place that they do, and so do plants. So this book is about sea otters. And where do sea otters choose to have their habitats? Do they do it in the desert? The mountains? The Arctic? No, they choose to live in the ocean because that's where they find their food, and that's where they like to swim. They have things on their bodies that allow them to swim. So it's a good habitat for them. So we can think about that while we're reading, and also the relationship. It's called Sea Otter Inlet by Celia Godkin. She must have done the illustrations too, because it's just her name on the front. Oh, and it has a dedication. This book is dedicated to you, dear reader. An inlet is like a little strip of water that's surrounded by land. In a long arm of the sea, hemmed in by land on either side, lived a colony of sea otters. Can you find them? The sea otters lived their whole lives in the waters of this inlet. They dived in the deep seaweedy forests of kelp, looking for good things to eat. They dined on crabs and shellfish, on sea stars and octopi, but their favorite food of all was the spiny purple sea urchin. The sea otter's on its back eating the sea urchin. After a meal of these delicacies, the otters groomed themselves with great care. When they were as clean as they could be, they wrapped themselves in a frond of kelp and went to sleep. This is the kelp. It's like big seaweed. The kelp anchored them gently in place so that they could not drift away. So boys and girls, this is pretty much a true story. Sea otters do love to eat sea urchins, and they do wrap themselves up in the kelp like a little blanket, and it holds them in place while they sleep so they don't float away. One day, the otters awoke from their nap to find hunters all around. The hunters hurled harpoons at them and tried to get them. Think about the impact that has. The otters dived to escape the hunters, but they could not stay below the water forever. The hunters waited patiently for the otters to come up for air. Because otters do not have gills like fish, they can't breathe underwater, but they can hold their breath for a long time. One by one, the hunters got the otters. They wanted them for their soft, warm fur. When there was no more otters left in this part of the ocean, the hunters sailed away, and life in the kelp forest went on. There were clingfish clinging to the flat, leaf-like blades of the kelp. There were kelpfish that ate the clingfish. And there were sea bass that ate the kelpfish. And there were many more fishes, too numerous to mention, swimming in and out of the kelp forest. But I don't see any sea otters. Do you? I see jellyfish, but not a sea otter. The kelp forest was made of giant seaweeds with flat leaf-like blades attached to a long, flexible stem. The stem went way, way down into the watery depths and attached to a piece of rock at the bottom. The attachment was called a holdfast. It anchored the kelp plant so that the kelp plant would not just float away. Living on the bottom, on and around the kelp holdfasts, were all kinds of shellfish. Some lived in cupped shells. Some lived in coiled shells like snails. and some lived in shells made of two halves hinged together. So a hinge is like when something can open and close, but that one part that stays together is the hinge. So that's like a mussel or a clam, an oyster. I'll show you that again. These are the ones that have the hinge. There were flower-like sea anemones. There were crabs. Let's see, where's a crab? Here's a crab. There were crabs and lobsters and shrimps. Here's a shrimp. There were 8-legged octopi and many-legged sun stars and 5-legged sea stars and brittle stars, and there were spiny purple sea urchin with no legs at all. For a long, long time, life in the kelp forest went on much as it always had, except that there was no sea otters collecting crabs and shellfish or sea stars and octopi. And there were no sea otters collecting their favorite food, the spiny purple sea urchin. Without the sea otter to eat them, the spiny purple sea urchins began to multiply. That means that they just kept reproducing and nothing was eating them. So pretty soon there was so many of them. The spiny purple sea urchins multiplied and multiplied. Soon there was an army of them marching across the forest floor. The spiny purple sea urchins ate all the kelp in their path. The animals that lived in the kelp didn't have a home anymore, and those animals went away too. I bet the hunters didn't think about that before they took all the sea otters. This is a bad negative impact. The kelp washed up on shore and rotted on the beaches. The animals washed ashore too and died in the hot sun. Those animals that lived on the bottom under the kelp had no place to hide. Other animals living outside the kelp forest came in to eat them. The army of spiny purple sea urchins moved across the forest floor. The kelp forest drifted away, and the animals that had found shelter there drifted away too, or stayed and got eaten because they had nowhere to hide. Then one day, a wonderful thing happened. Some sea otters swam into the inlet. Some otters had survived in places which the hunters had not found. No one was hunting them anymore. There were now enough otters that some could come back to live in their old home again. And I'm going to stop the story there. But I want you to think about what will happen. What do you think will happen now that some sea otters have come back? And I also want you to think about how were the sea otters, the urchins, the kelp, that's a plant, the hunters, how are they all related? And what happened when the hunters took the sea otters? Okay, so we'll talk more about those questions and finish our story on Monday.